Today, on Pat's Car Garage, it's springtime outside, which also means that it's springtime inside. And by which, of course, I mean DIY on how to replace the rear springs on the W164. So basically the reason I'm doing this is because in good old Canada, especially here in the province of Quebec, instead of plowing the roads, they like to just dump salt. Of course, that means stuff starts to corrode, and you see there's a lot of rust on my control arms here and the shock absorber, but you know, that's just surface rust. But still, that means that your springs will crack. Ain't that great? So that was from the other side. Pretty annoying because, you know, it's just a stupid thing. It's crack the spring, like, come on. Anyway, so basically, that's the motivation to do this job. It's to replace the springs. Now, you will need a spring compressor if you want to do it the easy way. But basically, to start, I like to jack up underneath the lower control arm. That's not where the jack is right now. Right now, it's underneath the subframe. But jack up underneath the lower control arm. That lets you, you know, lift up and put a jack stand on the jacking point, which you usually can't if you jack through the jacking point. So sit your jack stand down there, and jacking up underneath the lower control arm is great because it means you don't have to jack as much to remove the wheel. So yeah, take the wheel off, and that's all the disassembly you'll need to do if you have a spring compressor. Then, you know, be safe, stick the wheel under the car. My hydraulic jack is currently underneath the subframe. It's just, you know, there for additional support because you don't want the car to drop on you. And important trick, don't do both sides at the same time. So don't jack up on both sides, leave the other side down. That's gonna, it's a cool trick because if you use the spring compressor, we're actually gonna use the anti-roll bar to prevent the bushings from moving the entire hub upwards, because as soon as you start to compress the spring, all the bushings are gonna want to bring it upwards. But if the rear wheel is still on the ground, the anti-roll bar prevents that. So here's my spring compressor. It's just a plate type, which is what you need for that type of spring. It's a cheap eBay knockoff. I'm quite fond of it because the real tool costs 700 bucks. This cost me about 100, I forget exactly, maybe 150. And there's a ton of these kits on eBay and they're absolutely wonderful. They're a real lifesaver, and they make removing this type of spring pretty easy. Because this type of spring, there's always going to be a hole underneath the spring from which you can pass the spring compressor and squeeze it down. Of course, if you don't have a spring compressor, well, things get a little bit more difficult, and you would need to unbolt the shock absorber and probably the anti-roll bar also would have to be disconnected. And that, of course, with a jack, you can lower down the lower control arm and you'll be able to remove the spring that way. But of course, you know, if you live in a climate where they salt the roads real hard, well, you know, removing these rusty bolts gets pretty annoying. So spring compressor is the easiest method here. I'm not going to show you how to use the spring compressor, obviously, because first of all, it takes time and it's quite boring to watch me turn on a nut for, you know, for 10 minutes. So I'm just going to show you what it looks like once it's disassembled. So here is the spring in a slightly compressed form. Of course, you'll need to have it way more compressed than that to remove it. I just took some of the tension off because I don't like having springs under a crap load of tension just sitting around. So basically, what helped on this side, I didn't have to do it on the other side, but I just stuck a piece of 2x3 up there against the lower control arm, and it's just resting against the wheel arch, and that's just to prevent it from going up. On the other side, I only relied on the anti-roll bar, but here it was coming up a little bit, so I just decided to do that, and it made it a little bit easier, because then you don't have to compress the spring as much to remove it. If it's a little bit stuck, it's because it has to clear this little dingus right here in the middle. It has this kind of plastic mount that it goes on, and that's down the center, so you can stick in a long screwdriver and then just leverage on it, and then that should pop the spring out. And after that, you can either wiggle it out through there, or you can sort of wiggle it out between this link here and the lower control arm. Of course, before I forget to mention it, don't also forget the central, well, the bottom plastic piece. That's mainly there to, well, I bet it does a job also centering the spring on the lower control arm, but it also helps center the spring tool. the spring compressor, because it just fits snugly up the central part, so it keeps it centered. And there you go, one new spring is installed. I had to actually do a double take on this one, because the first time around I put the top plate too close to the, well, simply too close to the top, and then I wasn't able to release it because it was jammed up against this little rubber sleeve that they put on the spring. So I had to do it a second time, move the plate a little bit lower, just half a turn was enough, and the rest went off without a hitch. And here is the final result. All good, the wheels are tightened up, and no more sagging. Now the car sits nice and level.